Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。After a 3-day official visit, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan left China with news that California-based CPU maker Intel may face massive restructuring after mammoth losses directly related to Washington's China chip sanctions, which have seen Intel face its worst period in its entire 56-year history. The company posted operational losses of US $2.8 billion last quarter, saw its stocks drop 60% this year alone, and plans to cut up to 15,000 jobs. Despite it being clearly evident that Sullivan's chip sanctions are seriously damaging the US tech industry, he's adamant they will continue. Today, I'll chat with special guest Professor Warwick Powell to find out why Washington is so keen to cut off its own nose in spite of its face. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. When US Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo visited Beijing last year, Huawei released a new phone that showed off China's domestic chip-making progress and ultimately sent the Shenzhen tech giant's profits skyrocketing and sending the Apple iPhone plummeting to 6th place in China. All eyes were on Huawei this week as US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, a key figure in Washington's China chip sanctions, made an official 3-day visit. This from Bloomberg in an article titled "Sullivan Vows in Beijing Trip to Stay Course on China Chip Curbs." Jake Sullivan thought there was a reasonable chance that Huawei Technologies Co. would roll out a new phone or AI chip during his visit in a bid to embarrass him, the article said. It continues, yet for US officials who asked not to be identified discussing sensitive diplomatic relations, any Chinese moves would amount to little more than a propaganda exercise. They described the technical aspects of Huawei's phones as mediocre compared with all the fanfare, and said the US efforts to maintain a technological edge on China are working, no matter what Beijing says. In the end, Huawei did not time their new phone release to coincide with Sullivan's visit, but he was left with the shattering news that California-based chipmaker Intel, once the world's biggest chipmaker, is considering extensive restructuring and will lay off 15,000 employees after posting the worst losses since the company began way back in 1968. And Intel's luck is not set to improve anytime soon, with Washington adamant that their China chip sanctions, intended to limit China's ability to develop in its own advanced technologies, will continue. So to make sense of all this, I'm joined by Associate Professor Warwick Powell from the Queensland University of Technology and Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. Professor, it's good to have you back on the show. First up, I wanted to know if you feel there was any real expectation that the two sides would make any progress relating to chip sanctions during Sullivan's visit this week.
Good to be with you again, Andy. I don't think that anybody had any expectations that the status quo as it sits today was going to change in any substantial way. The die has been cast, and the American political elite have made a habit of doubling down on their strategic approaches and their initiatives that they've taken in relation to China, whether or not they're succeeding. So no, I don't think that there is any, or there was any expectation that there would be anything substantial as far as change was concerned.
Okay, I want to talk a bit about how Jake Sullivan relates to these chip sanctions, namely Washington's claims of national security concerns. For you, is it fair to claim that Chinese progress is a threat to US national security, or do you think it's more fair to say that China is a threat to US primacy?
Look, the Americans have come to a view over the course of the last 6 or 7 years that China's development poses what is in effect an existential threat to American hegemony. And as a result of that realization, if you will, it has adopted an aggressive posture that has framed China now not as a partner, but as a foe. And everything has flowed from that. This situation, I guess, picks up on many threads that have been in place over the course of the last 70 or 80 years, where the American political elite have, over the period of time, to varying extents, have sought to either mould or change China in a way that would suit America's interests, or if they couldn't do that, it would seek to suppress China. They've given up on moulding and shaping China. Jake Sullivan, in fact, earlier this year, you might recall, made the comment that the Americans have tried for a few decades already to mould and change China without any success, and they've given up on that. And therefore now the US has adopted a posture that if they can't change China, then they're going to have to somehow either suppress it or, in truth, some of them actually want to defeat China.
Yeah, well, it seems to be that they're actually doing a lot to defeat themselves. So these chip sanctions against China are having a really chilling effect on the US tech industry. I mentioned just before about the terrible state that Intel is in following the implementation of these sanctions around 2 years ago. And also how the Apple iPhone, which before was really quite popular, is plummeting in popularity as Chinese smartphones become more and more sought after. So why is it, do you think, that Washington is seemingly so hell-bent on cutting off its own nose?
There tends to be particularly in the game of politics, if you will, tends to be a problem of a sunk cost fallacy. It doesn't matter how much you've committed towards a particular action, even if it's failing, you feel that at the end of the day, you've got no choice but to dig in and keep doing it, because you'll lose reputation, lose face, or whatever it happens to be. So I think the American policy cycle, as it is mixed through with geopolitical and American exceptionalist attitudes, has reached a point where the American political elite feel that they have no alternatives but to double up, and that's what they're doing right now. This has, of course, taken place against a backdrop where clearly these initiatives haven't delivered the kind of results that many had sought to achieve or had hoped would come to fruition. 2 years ago, there were real hopes that the CHIPS Act and the sanctions against the export of high technologies to China would somehow do away with the Chinese high-tech threat to America. It would kill the Chinese chip industry and kill the Chinese high-tech industry. It hasn't done any of that. And we've got a situation now where not only did Huawei introduce its new phone model when Secretary Raimondo visited the China a while back, but you've got a situation where during this last week, when Sullivan visited China, Huawei didn't release a new phone model, but Huawei did release its latest earnings results, which showed that it has continued to grow, and that's on the back of a continual expansion of its market share, mainly at the expense of the Apple iPhone. And of course, when you look at the high tech or the semiconductor supply chain in the totality, we also see the growing impacts of China's export restrictions on key inputs such as gallium and germanium. So none of this was actually particularly good news for Sullivan, and the results, I think, are starting to show that the policy hasn't been working.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask you now my last question. I'm curious what your advice to Jake Sullivan would have been if you were in Beijing and taking part in those discussions this week.
Well, I think it's pretty hard to give advice to somebody who has locked themselves into a policy path on the basis of unfounded anxieties, which has closed themselves off from the ability to think rationally through what is actually a complex environment. The semiconductor sector globally has evolved over the last so many decades into a very complex, interconnected network of firms and capabilities with upstream and downstream relationships that are very difficult to unwind with a mere stroke of the legislative pen. The United States has, over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years, sought to revitalise its own semiconductor manufacturing capabilities with substantial subsidies to Korean and Taiwanese capabilities with the hopes of building new fabs in Arizona. These hopes have been dashed so far. It hasn't happened. The saga concerning Intel is another example of the problems that have been occasioned by a policy framework that has actually cut off market access for Western microprocessor companies, whilst at the same time catalysing a ecosystem development in China that would have been very difficult to pull off without an externally imposed requirement. So now what do we see? We see in China, obviously having to commit a lot more resources than China would otherwise have done so, a vibrant ecosystem has emerged. An ecosystem that is pushing the boundaries of technology development, and one which is rapidly catching up to some of the leading edge technologies that have been developed elsewhere. And the last thing I'll say, Andy, is that China has always been a very pragmatic place when it comes to how technologies work. And the development in high technology that has been occurring over the last few years has actually been accompanied by a rapid ability to translate technology developments into practical solutions that are finding their way into society and into business processes. So China has become a technology society more than anything else, as opposed to merely being a leader in the development of technologies per se.
Very interesting. Associate Professor Warwick Powell, thank you so much for your insights today.
Absolute pleasure.
And on that note, that will be all for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you expect a new Huawei phone for Sullivan's visit? And what will China's next tech breakthrough be? And do you think the chip sanctions might end with the new US president? Let me know down below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.